Now, I don't want this to rub you the wrong way, but this topic can be a little rough. I don't really want this to cause any friction between us.
Oh, I get it! I get it! Oh, very...
That's not funny. That was great.
Roll the intro.
Do you feel the vibes?
Now, many of you have probably heard of friction before, but in a physics context or in a physics sense, you might be wondering,
Friction is what now?
friction is a force that resists the sliding or rolling of one object over another. That means that it's responsible for this super iconic scene from Akira. Now, you may not believe me about how iconic friction is, but alright, I think you get the picture. Now, friction may be more complicated in a physics sense, but without friction, our world would kind of be like this.
Oh, everything is awful, and my legs don't work.
That's because when we walk, we are effectively trying to slide our foot over the ground, and friction is preventing our foot from sliding, ergo propelling us forward. But how can we represent this sliding of one material over another mathematically? Well, we use the equation for the force of friction. Force of friction is equal to mu times the normal force. If you recall, the normal force is related to how hard a surface is pushing on another surface. That means that our frictional force is going to be based on how hard the two surfaces push together. You may notice that it's easier to slide a lighter object than a heavy one across a floor. That's because the normal force in that case would be equal to the force of gravity if the object's on a flat surface. And the normal force for the heavy object would be greater because the weight of the heavy object is greater. Okay, so that's the normal force. But what about mu? Unfortunately, wrong mu. The mu we're talking about is actually a property of the material. Every material is actually a bit rough on the surface. That roughness actually means that the normal force extends in multiple different directions. The ones that we really care about are the ones that are perpendicular to the surface, i.e. the actual normal force that we're used to, and the bit that comes in the other direction, the parallel direction to the surface. The bit in the parallel direction will depend on how rough the surface is, because that relates to the number and amount of individual forces that will be pushing on the object. This mu actually comes in two different flavors for each set of surfaces that we have.
What?
Yes, mu2. That means there are actually two mu's. The first we'll look at is called kinetic. Mu k, or the coefficient of kinetic friction, is actually a stable property of the material, which relates to when an object is moving along the material. This value, mu k, does not change as the object moves, meaning that as long as the normal force stays constant, this will be a non-variable force. Mu s, or the coefficient of static friction, gives us a threshold value for how much force it would take the object to begin moving if the object is at rest. It means that when we're using mu s, or when we have static friction, the frictional force is a variable force. It can be any value up to the value of mu s times Fn. And if it ever exceeds that value, then the object will start moving. In that case, we would use kinetic friction, and then we would move back to our mu k. So if you've ever tried to push something really heavy, and had some difficulty, until suddenly you got it to start moving, then you were able to continue it moving all along, that's because of the difference between the static coefficient of friction, which is always equal to or higher than the kinetic coefficient of friction, and the kinetic coefficient of friction, making it such that it's easier to move when the object is already moving. So the last thing we need to talk about is direction. Since friction is a force, and forces are vectors, that means that we have to consider the direction of the frictional force. Now, I already talked a little bit about what causes friction, and that it's these micro interactions of rough surfaces in the parallel direction to the surface, which means that the frictional force will always have to be parallel to the surface rather than perpendicular like the normal force. Friction also always opposes motion. That means that the frictional force is always in the opposite direction of whatever the velocity or potential velocity is. That's an important distinction. It's not necessarily against the net acceleration of the object. In fact, for an object that's slowing down, let's say as it's sliding, friction is the force causing the acceleration, or deceleration in this case. In cases of static friction, the object isn't moving. That means that the friction has to oppose whatever force would make it move, since it would oppose the potential velocity in that case. And that's really all there is to it. You would just use the frictional force as another force on your force diagram. And then at that point, you would have to solve for the normal force. Once you know the normal force, you can calculate the frictional force that you'll be using for the problem. It seems odd, but it just really adds one level of complication to your problem to add friction. It just means that in problems where the normal force would be somewhat irrelevant because it's directly canceled by the weight of the object, it's not. You would still need to know the normal force in order to figure out the frictional force. So that just means you have to set up a system of equations and then solve it. Alright, that'll do it for our video on friction. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, leave any questions you have